23 minutes after the hour of 8 a.m. Central Time here where we are. And, of course, the voice you just heard was Fred Dashevsky. I'm so glad we have you back on the show, sir. We've had you on.
Good morning.
Yeah, I made fun of the consumer price index this morning because the economic news is out and it's like, ooh, what, 0.3 of a point? What a joke.
CPI and other fallacies, as we used to say.
I'm telling you, Fred Dashevsky is with uscoincapital.com if you haven't been there yet. And I was actually talking about you earlier on the show. It was all good. I was telling people, look, if you're thinking about buying into an annuity or a CD, understand that you're giving your money to somebody else that's going to make money off you. And I just told people a long time ago, look, got to check spot price, and you need to understand what spot price is. You need to understand what premiums are. You need to understand the difference between collecting junk silver and gold or numismatic value, because there are a lot of coin collectors out there that want to put their value in something other than our government. And when you got all these foreign countries selling their treasury bonds back to the Fed, we need to start worrying, don't we?
Well, I think you have a good handle on this, and it is a fundamental problem. So what's interesting to me is how our market of gold and silver coins has evolved way past just the average collector. You know, it's now spread out to include most average American investors who are looking to just do that, to kind of hedge their bets against the U.S. dollar. You know, for an average American to try to understand how the Fed operates and the mechanism it uses to alter monetary policy and keep up with government spending, it's a little mind-boggling. I mean, we hear numbers of trillions of dollars, and it's kind of hard to even grasp the nature of how big these numbers are. But the impact it's having on Americans is becoming very visible. And I find that almost encouraging that inflation has gotten so out of control that, you know, the government can't hide it anymore. It's like trying to sweep a little dirt under the carpet. You can get away with that for a while, but you can't hide a bowling ball. So, you know, at some point, things become a little too obvious. And most Americans are starting to scratch their heads about the weakness they're beginning to see and the buying power they get every day out of their dollar. And they're looking for an alternative. And it's a sad state for the United States to have to face this problem. Fundamentally, you know, we shouldn't have to deal with this. It was a flaw in decision-making by politicians and bankers. And I think it was obviously done on purpose to shift control. And this battle of who would run the currency system of this country, believe it or not, dates back to the 1790s.
It does. And see, I've been encouraging my friends to ditch the annuities and the CDs and go for something with intrinsic value and forget about this system, this economy. I even this week, Fred, you love this. You remember the old 40-page document, Modern Money Mechanics?
Yes.
I put that out online this week and said, look, you need to read this and understand how fractionalized banking systems work and how this country will never, ever be able to repay this one. Our national debt, it's like, why are we burdened with this thing? We have $1 trillion of debt, of interest payment on the current debt, 33 point something, $6 trillion in debt and runaway spending. They keep printing more money. We'll never be able to repay it. If people read Modern Money Mechanics, they will understand that completely. We will never, ever repay the national debt. The options are walk away from it. You think our government will do that? Oh, no, they'd have to admit they're the cause of the problem.
And they certainly don't want to do that.
Oh, no.
And, of course, now you think about the amount of obligations we have. So the government holds debt in various forms. First of all, they have obligations to pension accounts. So these are employees of the federal government. There are roughly 170 various government pensions that are underfunded. In other words, the government tried to utilize the capital within those supposedly secured funds, ended up spending them in current money and never replaced the funds. So it now has a deficit hole it has to replace. The biggest one, of course, most people are familiar with Social Security, and the hole there is massive and growing. And the problem is the rate at which government is deficit spending has begun to accelerate at such a rapid pace that a couple of mathematicians have stopped and said, well, wait a minute, if we just looked at this as numbers, forgetting about the cause and what they are, we're beginning to see a very dangerous pattern. The accelerated rate of interest payments on the growing deficits are getting so fast, so large, so quickly that we may spiral into a point where they spend more money the debt increases, the interest payments go up, the amount of obligations grow, and it spirals into a debt circle that they can never get out of. And I agree with you. I think the size of the current national debt, and again, we're only talking about the bonded treasuries of 33.6 trillion, is already unrepayable. So that leaves a few options that are not good from any point of view if you were in the government. Number one, if you did, as you suggest, default, now you have all these people that are holding treasuries that are subtly being told, we're not going to make good on that obligation. If we were to do that or hint at that, or even the problem where, to poke its head around the corner, the sell-off of U.S. treasuries could be massive. And the further problem that would create is, what about the additional bonds that have to be sold in the current world? Not only do we have the existing obligations that are already out there, but as the government deficit spends, it has to create more debt. It has to create more treasuries to raise the capital to fund itself. If we can't find buyers, the end result is either it goes to the traders. That means these are secondary market holders of U.S. treasuries that would have to find another buyer at some point to resell, or the last resort, which has been the case recently, is the Federal Reserve itself ends up accumulating all of these treasuries from the U.S. Treasury Department directly. That is what they would call quantitative easing. But the problem with that is when the Fed becomes the sole resource of buying government debt, it's just a signal that no one else is interested. No one else cares enough to carry your debt or has the confidence in it. This week, for example, Moody's, the credit rating agency, gave the U.S. dollar a negative rating. Now, they kept it at AAA. S&P downgraded it. Fitch downgraded it a couple months back. And now Moody's, number 3, has turned around and said, look, we're starting to get so concerned about the numbers, we can't sit here and pretend anymore that there's nothing wrong with the U.S. dollar. I find that the problem in my mind is that a lot of the way the economy works today is sort of based on confidence, not really reality, not fundamentals, not structure, but this belief system that the public will buy into and the world will buy into, that it's safe to own U.S. dollars. If that were to crack, if that confidence breaks, we would face a fundamental problem that would start to make us look like Argentina or Brazil or any of these other countries who've had an implosion of their currency values. And I think you point out an interesting thing. There's really a couple different kinds of money. There's sound money, there's real money, then there's paper money, and there's fiat money. And fiat money has been a failed experiment. I mean, you can go back to the days of, Kublai Khan, where he made Marco Polo pay him in paper. He would take Marco Polo's silver and gold that he would bring from around the world to trade for goods, and he would force him to turn that into paper and use the paper to buy the goods and services. Again, this is a flawed process. The U.S. has been running a fiat system since 1971, and if we look at the purchasing power of money since then, we've lost about 92 to 93% of the purchasing power. What's it going to look like in 5 or 10 years when the U.S. government is carrying, instead of 33.6 trillion, what if we're at 50 trillion in debt in 8 years? What's the interest alone going to look like?
Well, the bigger problem is we have the securities market and the secondaries propping up all our mortgages with all of these MERS-originated mortgage loans that we've been dealing with since 2008 when the first collapse happened. And now the second shoe is about to drop. We've got commercial. I mean, we're talking about a quadrillion at least of securities. I mean, you knew this was going to come up. I mean, I can't leave this thing alone. I've been studying this thing all the way back into how these securities were created. And what they did was they took these mortgage loans and they converted them into equitable interest, chopped them up into little pieces like Anthony Bourdain showed on The Big Short, and he's chopping them all up. And look, I made this fish stew. I mean, you can only repackage. You can only repackage this crap so much.
They took the fish stew and then they broke that up and they added tons of water to it and then started to sell it as a liquid drink. They multiplied the effect of this so far forward that when this implosion happened, it just was absolutely devastating. And, when you consider the rate at which they're gimmicking the system, the problem is most of the system now is running on the fact that everything is being gimmicked. When a central bank intervenes in an economy, it creates a very false sense of security. And it really is unfair to the public because it leads to a belief system that there is some sustainability in the value of money. But I think people are beginning to recognize that's not something they should count on. And I've been encouraging the American people to just consider diversifying a portion of their wealth outside of paper, because in the end, sound money will stand, but fiat money will not. And in the end, it's going to be inevitable that a paper currency that is unbacked is going to be diluted to the point where it'll be unrecognizable. And how far does it have to go before people stop and say, okay, I've been working my life, I've been saving my money, I've been doing the right things, I've been following the plan. And now that I've earned this capital at the end of my life, I go to spend it, and suddenly I find it just doesn't buy crap. What happened? What did I do wrong? Well, fundamentally, they did nothing wrong. They did it exactly as they were supposed to. They were gimmicked by a game they could not control because outside forces much, much larger than them behind the scenes were altering the value of currency. It was never supposed to be this way. In fact, that's why the original founding fathers, after giving this serious consideration after the end of the Revolutionary War and looking at the history of money, looking at the history of banking in Europe going back hundreds of years, recognized that the safest thing for the American public would be a sound money system, something backed by something tangible. And that's why we had that gold standard and those silver coins initially from the 1790s, and it lasted, right through the 1970s. And I remember in 1971, I was very young, but I remember hearing about the removal of the standard of gold and silver against the U.S. dollar. And even at that age, I knew something was wrong. I didn't understand it enough to get it together, but I knew there was a problem. And now here we are. We're beginning to experience the onslaught of the worst possible scenario of running amok. And I used to make the analogy, it's like if you were a gambler and you had a friend that had pretty much unlimited capital, and every time you lost money, he'd give you more. Well, what would stop you from taking another lousy bet? Because you knew in the end you had a backstop. But what if that backstop suddenly said, okay, you're cut off, Dave. You can't spend another dollar, and you now have to actually deal with all of the debt that you've incurred. Well, your game plan is going to have to change. And the problem for politicians is that those that even understand this, they're kind of in an awkward position. They would either have to tell the public, here's our solution. We're going to have to raise more capital. Well, how does the government do that? Well, they raise your taxes. Does any politician really want to go to the American public and admit that they're going to have to raise trillions upon trillions of dollars in tax revenue? So what's the other option? Well, they could try to cut government spending. Well, how do you do that when the increasing deficits are growing every year at an increasing pace that's becoming almost parabolic? On top of which, every few months, we seem to have a new reason to create more money. And I'm not suggesting that there's anything wrong with some of these, like, supporting Israel or supporting war efforts and supporting our military. Okay, we can get behind that, fundamentally and psychologically and accept the notion that these are things government should do. But where does the money come from? When you're already deficit spending at $33 trillion in the hole and then you decide to spend another $100 billion you don't have, again, you're creating a fundamental problem. There is no sign at all in my mind that the rate of deficit spending is ever going to slow down, let alone ever be able to be sustainable. And I think this is going to create a fundamental flaw that the public is going to have to address one way or the other.
Well, they're spending, and you got interest upon interest upon interest on the war debt, and they're financing both sides of it. The central banks are financing both sides of this war.
Do you remember when the first war broke out, the first Gulf War, they had told us at that point we were looking at about $1 billion worth of expenditures. And then they anticipated oil would be recovered and somehow it would pay for itself. Well, between the wars that we've started since that period, we're $10 trillion in the hole in war spending. And again, I don't see that stopping anytime soon. The U.S. seems to continually take on the idea that we have to protect the world. That will probably continue as long as I'll be around. I think that there'll be perpetually more and more of these, I call them exogenous events, things that are not part of the regular economic environment that pop up and require government to spend money. And again, the government seems to step up on each of those and goes ahead and says, fine, we'll finance this and we'll finance that. But they're doing it on the back of the public. And the public is feeling the impact of this because the creation of capital in the past few years has simply been staggering. We were at $20 trillion in national debt at the end of the Obama administration. That was not that long ago. I mean, we're not talking about we're going back to 1955. We're talking about Obama. This was 2017, 2018. We had $20 trillion in debt. And it had taken decades to get to that point, where the next $13 trillion, getting us to the current 33, took us just 5 years. So the rate at which this is accelerating is becoming a little disconcerting.
Yeah, this is why I said we could have this conversation could go on and on for hours, Fred, because the knowledge you have, having 39 years in the business in the rare U.S. gold and silver coin industry, is phenomenal in of itself. And folks, this is one of the reasons why we're talking about the difference between, and I went to your website this morning, I was looking at it, and I'm like, okay,
Excellent.
there aren't that many things in the store right now. But this is the thing, folks. You get an education. If you haven't been to uscoincapital.com, and that's capital as in the nation's capital with an OL.com, and looked, there's actually educational notices on that website where if you go there, you can look at coins. And what Fred does is analyze and give you a historical perspective on where the coins came from. And you actually have the opportunity to email them at US Coin Capital and ask them about currency you currently hold, what its value is.
We'll try to provide an awful lot of consultation for investors to help guide them because, I am reminded frequently, as you pointed out, I've been doing this for almost 40 years. Some of these things become so second nature to me that, I talk about gold coins. I mentioned a Saint and four the other day, and somebody stopped me and said, I'm sorry, what language is that? And I said, okay, I'm sorry. What I was referring to is a $20 gold coin known as a St. Gaudens, and its condition was mint state 64. We call that a Saint and four, just, shorthand. But again, that type of thing becomes very second nature for us that have been involved. But for a lot of people that are new to this, it makes it almost difficult to understand the nature of the simplicity of gold and silver coins. And we do deal with some very basic things like pre-64 dimes, quarters, and halves. These are just silver coins. People spent them as kids. People saw them when they were young. They still circulated. Every once in a while, you still run across a silver quarter or a silver half dollar. And they don't sell for much more than their metal content. But it's a great way for people to accumulate protection wealth. We also deal with a lot of the standard gold coins, which were $20 and $10 and $5. And we do help people understand the nature of both how that would benefit them, how to properly accumulate them, which particular coins would make sense given their position. And we will take time to talk with people. That is the point of our website. That's why there isn't an awful lot in the storefront. We have packaged a few things. I put up specials from time to time. But what we're encouraging people to do is give us a call so that we can actually talk with them individually and do something that would make sense for that particular person. I think in the broad picture, it's about percentages. I think people should have maybe 15 or 20% of their net worth in something not paper. Otherwise, I just think you're relying too much on something that we can't count on anymore. I used to believe that we could sustain the value of paper money because Congress could intervene and do something smart. Well, I've kind of given up on that idea, I'm afraid. And, we spent an awful lot of time trying to educate people in the early days that there was a Federal Reserve and what it was as a central bank and how that influenced the value of money people spent. One thing that I find very interesting is that the advent of the internet, the information has spread so considerably the past, let's say, 10 years or so. I'm sure most of your listening audience now at least are somewhat familiar with the fact that the Fed exists, and they may know a little bit about it. And people recognize, Jerome Powell's name. And when I first started with this, nobody knew what the Fed was. We spent most of our time trying to explain to people that this was not a government agency, that we had this private institution that controlled money. And it was so hard for people to grasp. At least now, that is no longer really the big issue. So I think we can move from that and say, okay, if we accept the notion that there's this player behind the scenes, what do we do about it? Can we attack it as a country and say, let's get rid of it? There are politicians who've tried that with very limited success. I mean, Ron Paul couldn't even get Congress to agree to audit the Fed, let alone ending the Fed. So if people can get a grasp on the fact that paper money will change in value by forces that you cannot control, it becomes easy to understand why you should not bank the rest of your capital and your retirement savings in this form. And I believe sound money stands the test of time. Gold and silver have been around for thousands of years as a form of currency for very good reason. You can't go in your backyard and stick a shovel in the ground and pull up an ounce of gold. You just can't do it. It's a difficult product to mine. It takes time, and original gold and silver coins cannot be reproduced. Whatever the government minted before we decided to no longer do this is all that will ever exist for every future generation. So I really encourage the public, take possession, physical hold of some actual gold and silver coins. It will really help you in your financial wealth and financial health, if you will.
Right. Now, what have you got going on? Because I know that you run specials from time to time. What have you got going on right now at U.S. Coin Capital?
I saved a couple things just for the show. So I've got a group of silver dollars that go back before 1921. They're known as Morgan silver dollars. They were the standard U.S. silver coin from 1878 to 1921, where we switched to what were known as peace dollars after the end of World War I. The silver Morgans from 1878 to 1921 are available in circulated condition. They run around $30, $40 a coin. Top grade mint conditions could be $200 to $300. Well, there is a mint condition example that we have available, 20 coins, and they run about $115 a coin. They come in a Robox, it's called. When they're graded, each one of them has been certified to be guaranteed to be both authentic and also certified in mint condition. And then after that process has been done, we have then screened those coins that have been graded to pick out the best examples within the condition. And that box of 20 coins is $2,300, $115 a coin.
And see, Moody's, it is. Moody's, Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch's can't do what they did to all these bonds that they peddled out there that rated them AAA like they're doing to our Fed currency rating. I mean, come on, AAA, really? You don't trust that. This is what you need to trust is gold, because it has intrinsic value, not this paper garbage that's floating around on Wall Street, folks. I told you to get out of the markets and start thinking about gold. Fred Dashevsky, we're going to have you back on again. You know that, because like I said, this conversation can go on and on talking about the economy. But folks, go to uscoincapital.com, get educated, give Fred a call, 800-878-2646. We'll post this on the website. You need to interact and get some numismatic product in your pocket. God bless you. God bless the United States of America.
If they're brand new to the market, we have plenty of patience to walk people through how to do this properly. And honestly, if you're not talking to somebody who's willing to help you get educated, move on to somebody else.
I appreciate that, Fred. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back. See you tomorrow.